David, a young man from a humble shepherd's family, had a heart full of courage and faith. From his early years, no one paid much attention to him, not even his own family, who often overlooked him in the demanding tasks of farm life. Yet David found solace in the fields, tending to his sheep. It was there, under the vast open skies, that he developed a deep connection with God. While watching over his flock, David encountered countless dangers, from wild animals like lions and bears that threatened the safety of his sheep. But David faced these creatures with unwavering determination, trusting that God would give him the strength to protect his herd. Armed with only his sling and a staff, David defeated these wild beasts, a testament to his strength, but more importantly, his faith in God's protection. One day, the prophet Samuel, a revered and faithful servant of God, received a divine command. The Lord had rejected Saul, the first king of Israel, due to his disobedience. Samuel was to go to Bethlehem, where the family of Jesse resided, and find the new king whom God had chosen. Samuel, troubled by the task, knew the significance of this mission. He arrived at Jesse's house, where the sons of Jesse gathered, each one appearing strong and capable. At first glance, they all seemed suitable to rule the nation. Yet God spoke to Samuel, guiding him that none of these sons were the chosen one. Man looks at the outward appearance, but God looks at the heart, God reminded Samuel. This was a radical shift in perspective. Samuel had expected the new king to be someone grand and imposing, someone that people could admire with their eyes. Instead, God was looking for a man with a heart full of devotion and courage, a heart after God's own. After rejecting each of Jesse's sons, Samuel, confused but trusting in God's voice, asked, "Are these all the sons you have?" Jesse replied almost absent-mindedly that there was still the youngest, David, who was out tending the sheep. Samuel, following God's direction, insisted that David be brought to him. As David entered the house, a young man covered in dirt from the fields, God immediately spoke to Samuel, declaring, "Rise and anoint him. This is the one." Despite his youthful appearance and humble background, David was chosen by God. Samuel poured oil on his head, marking him as God's anointed king. From that moment, the Spirit of the Lord filled David, empowering him for the journey ahead. The simple shepherd boy, forgotten by his family, had just been anointed as the future king of Israel. David's life would never be the same. Although he continued his daily routine, tending sheep and living a life of simplicity, he now carried the weight of God's call on his life. Little did David know that his journey would soon lead him into a series of events that would test his faith and shape him into the leader God had destined him to become. His future was far from assured, and challenges awaited that would require every ounce of courage and trust in God. For now, though, David remained in Bethlehem, living with the awareness that God's plans for him were unfolding, even though no one else saw it yet. Soon after, the armies of Israel faced a new threat from the Philistines. Among the enemy was a warrior unlike any other, Goliath, a giant standing over 9 feet tall, whose mere presence struck fear into the hearts of the Israelite soldiers. For 40 days, Goliath issued his challenge, daring anyone from Israel to face him in single combat. The Israelites, paralyzed by fear, hesitated to fight the giant. It was in this moment of crisis that David, still a young shepherd, came to the battlefield to bring provisions for his brothers who were part of the army. When David saw the giant taunting the Israelites, his heart burned with righteous anger. He could not understand why no one would stand up to Goliath and defend the honor of God. David's boldness caught the attention of King Saul, who initially doubted his ability to face such a formidable foe. But David, with unwavering confidence, recounted how he had defended his sheep from lions and bears, and how he believed that the same God who had protected him then would deliver him from the giant. David's faith was evident in every word he spoke. He knew that the battle was not his, but the Lord's. Saul, although reluctant, finally agreed to let David face Goliath, and he offered him his armor. But David, not accustomed to such heavy gear, chose to face the giant in the simplest of ways, armed with nothing but his sling and 5 smooth stones. As David approached Goliath, the giant mocked him, calling him a mere boy. But David, with a steadfast spirit, replied, "You come against me with sword and spear, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands." David's words were filled with faith, not in his own strength, but in God's power. With a single stone from his sling, David struck Goliath in the forehead, and the giant fell to the ground, defeated. The army of Israel, once cowering in fear, was now emboldened by the victory. David had proven that God's power could overcome even the most daunting obstacles. This victory was more than just a military triumph. It was a declaration of God's sovereignty and faithfulness. The entire nation of Israel witnessed the power of a young shepherd who trusted in God. David's name became known throughout Israel, and from that moment, the path was set for him to rise as the king that God had anointed. Yet, as with all divine callings, David's journey would not be without hardship and testing. His faith and obedience would be challenged, and he would soon find that being God's chosen leader would come with trials that would shape his character and prepare him for the throne. David's victory over Goliath marked the beginning of a series of challenges that would test his faith and character. He had risen from humble beginnings to national hero, but with this newfound fame came envy and opposition. King Saul, who had once welcomed David into his service, began to feel threatened by the young man's growing popularity. Saul, who had once been the people's king, saw David's success as a sign that he was losing his grip on the throne. This jealousy began to take root in Saul's heart, and soon he could no longer mask his animosity toward David. At first, Saul tried to disguise his jealousy. He called David into his service, making him a commander in his army. David's military campaigns were nothing short of successful. He won battle after battle, his reputation growing with each victory. People began to sing songs about David, saying, "Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands." This praise, meant to honor both men, only deepened Saul's resentment. The very people who had once hailed Saul as their king were now singing the praises of the young shepherd turned hero. Saul, unable to control his emotions, became consumed with jealousy and paranoia. One day, while David was playing his harp to soothe Saul's troubled spirit, Saul, overcome with jealousy, hurled a spear at him. David narrowly avoided the spears, but it became clear to him that Saul's hatred had grown to dangerous levels. David fled, knowing that staying in Saul's presence would mean certain death. From that moment on, David became a fugitive, running from a king who had once been his protector but had now become his enemy. His life, once filled with the simple rhythms of shepherding, was now filled with the dangers of hiding in caves, evading Saul's soldiers, and struggling to survive. David's escape was not only a matter of physical survival, but also of spiritual growth. In his flight, he learned to rely entirely on God. No longer in the comfort of his family or the security of Saul's court, David found himself in desperate situations where only God's intervention could save him. The caves of Adullam became his refuge, but they were not merely physical shelters. It was in these dark, isolated places that David's faith was tested and refined. It was here that he began to form a small band of loyal followers, outcasts and misfits, who, like David, had nowhere else to turn. These men, whom David would later call his mighty men, became the core of his future kingdom. Together they shared in the hardships of the wilderness, learning to trust one another and their leader. While in hiding, David faced another significant test of his character. One day, Saul, in pursuit of David, entered a cave where David and his men were hiding. David's followers, seeing this as an opportunity to end their misery, urged David to kill Saul and take the throne for himself. But David, with a heart after God's, refused to harm the Lord's anointed king. Instead, he secretly cut off a piece of Saul's robe, an act that would later serve as proof of his restraint. David's mercy toward Saul was not only a reflection of his faith, but also a demonstration of his understanding that God's timing and plans were perfect. He knew that he was not to take the throne by force or assassination, but through God's appointed time. After Saul left the cave, David called after him and revealed the piece of his robe, showing Saul that he had spared his life. Saul, moved by David's mercy, wept and acknowledged that David would one day be king. However, Saul's repentance was short-lived. His jealousy flared up again, and he continued to pursue David, determined to destroy him. David, ever the fugitive, continued to evade Saul, relying on God for protection and guidance. During this time, David's heart remained focused on the Lord. He composed many of the Psalms during these years in the wilderness, pouring out his anguish, his trust in God, and his longing for deliverance. The Psalms that David wrote in the caves are some of the most poignant expressions of faith in the Bible. They reflect a man who was not without fear, but who placed his hope in God's unfailing love. David understood that while the world may be against him, God was his refuge and strength, a constant help in times of trouble. David's journey from the shepherd's fields to the caves of Adullam was not just a physical journey, but a spiritual one. Through the trials and struggles, David was being shaped into the man who would one day rule Israel. He learned to rely on God's promises, to trust in his timing, and to be patient as he waited for the fulfillment of God's plan. Though David had been anointed king, he had not yet ascended to the throne. His path to the crown would not be easy, and it would be marked by betrayal, hardship, and the weight of responsibility. One of the most pivotal moments in David's fugitive years came when he encountered a man named Nabal, a wealthy but foolish man who insulted David and his men after they had protected his flocks. David, angry at the disrespect, prepared to take action against Nabal. But Nabal's wise and courageous wife, Abigail, intervened, bringing provisions to David and apologizing for her husband's behavior. And she pleaded with David not to take vengeance into his own hands and reminded him that God would surely bring justice. David, moved by Abigail's wisdom and faith, thanked her and spared Nabal's life. This encounter taught David a valuable lesson about trusting God to bring about justice in his own time, rather than taking matters into his own hands. As the years passed, David continued to grow in wisdom and strength, learning what it meant to be a leader of men. He understood that true leadership came not from force or ambition, but from a heart that was humble before God. He continued to evade Saul's pursuit, all the while knowing that God's promise to make him king would eventually be fulfilled. But David's trials were far from over. One day, after another successful military campaign, Saul's jealousy flared up once again. The people began to praise David more than Saul, and Saul's rage grew. In a fit of anger, Saul threw a spear at David while he was playing his harp, narrowly missing him. David knew that his time in Saul's court was over, and he fled once more. His journey as a fugitive had become a long and grueling test of his faith. It was during these years of hiding and running that David's character was fully formed, preparing him for the throne he had been promised. David's time as a fugitive was a period of deep personal struggle, but it was also one of spiritual growth. Throughout this time, he was faced with the constant threat of death from Saul, his former protector turned enemy. Yet David remained steadfast in his faith, constantly seeking guidance from God in the midst of his trials. It was a time of preparation, not only for David as a future king, but also for the loyal band of men who followed him. These men, once outcasts and misfits, grew into a mighty force under David's leadership. They shared in his hardships, stood by him through thick and thin, and became his closest companions. During these years, David had several opportunities to take matters into his own hands and end his fugitive status. But time and time again, he chose the path of patience, trusting that God's plan would unfold in its perfect timing. One such opportunity came when Saul, once again in pursuit of David, entered a cave where David and his men were hiding. David's men, seeing Saul at his most vulnerable, urged David to take the chance and kill Saul. But David, with his heart firmly rooted in God's will, refused. Instead, he secretly cut a piece of Saul's robe as proof of his restraint. When Saul left the cave, David followed him, calling out to him from a distance. He revealed the piece of Saul's robe and showed him that he had spared his life, even though he had the opportunity to kill him. Saul, deeply moved by David's mercy, acknowledged that David was in fact the chosen one of God, destined to be the next king of Israel. However, this brief moment of reconciliation was short-lived. Saul's jealousy and fear resurfaced, and he once again sought to kill David. This cycle of repentance and relapse would continue, but it became evident that David's trust in God's plan for his life would never waver. As time passed, David's reputation continued to grow and his fame spread throughout Israel. Yet, despite his growing influence, he did not seek the throne for himself. Instead, he waited for God's perfect timing to bring him into the position of leadership. His faith and patience were continuously tested, but with each trial, David's heart grew closer to God. It was in these moments of uncertainty and danger that David truly became the man God had called him to be, a leader with a heart after God's own. David's years as a fugitive were not spent in idle hiding. Rather, they were a time of building relationships, strengthening his faith, and preparing for the kingship that would one day be his. His leadership was not forged in the palace, but in the wilderness, among the outcasts and the oppressed. These men, who had nothing to their name but their loyalty to David, would stand by him through thick and thin, fighting alongside him in battles and supporting him in his darkest moments. It was during this time that David's character as a king in the making was truly shaped. His interactions with others, especially with those who betrayed or challenged him, revealed the depth of his integrity and his refusal to seek vengeance. When Nabal, a wealthy but foolish man, insulted David and refused to offer him provisions, David in his anger prepared to destroy Nabal and his household. But Nabal's wife, Abigail, intervened. With wisdom and humility, she brought provisions to David and apologized for her husband's behavior. She reminded David that God would bring justice in his own time and that vengeance was not his to take. David, moved by her words, spared Nabal's life and praised Abigail for her wisdom. This encounter was a pivotal moment in David's journey, teaching him the importance of trusting God to handle the matters of justice and vengeance. As the years wore on, the tension between David and Saul continued to build. Saul, now consumed by jealousy, became increasingly paranoid. His hatred for David grew to the point where he was willing to do anything to destroy him. But David, despite the danger and the constant threat to his life, never sought to kill Saul. Instead, he chose to rely on God's timing and waited for the day when God would make him king. He understood that the throne was not something to be seized by force, but something that would be given to him by God in his own time. One of the most telling moments of David's leadership came when he had the opportunity to kill Saul once again. Saul, after a long pursuit of David, was camped with his army, sleeping in a tent. David and his companion Abishai snuck into the camp. There, Saul lay asleep with his spear stuck in the ground near his head. Abishai, seeing the opportunity, urged David to kill Saul, but David refused. He took Saul's spear and water jug as proof that he had spared Saul's life, but he would not harm the man who had once been his mentor. David's restraint was a powerful testimony to his faith and to his understanding that God alone would decide when it was time for Saul to fall. After this incident, David once again confronted Saul, showing him the spear and the water jug. Saul, moved by David's mercy, wept and acknowledged that David would one day be king. But once again, Saul's repentance was fleeting. His jealousy and fear took hold of him once more, and he continued his pursuit of David. This pattern of forgiveness and reconciliation, followed by Saul's relapse into anger, continued for years. Yet throughout it all, David remained patient and steadfast in his trust that God was in control of the situation. David's years as a fugitive also saw him growing in wisdom and leadership. He led a group of loyal followers who shared in his struggles and victories. Together, they fought against Israel's enemies, and David's military acumen became renowned. But more than just a warrior, David was also a man of compassion. He understood what it meant to be an outcast, to be overlooked and rejected by those closest to him. This understanding gave him the ability to lead with empathy and to care deeply for those who followed him. Throughout this period, David continued to compose psalms, pouring out his heart to God in moments of despair, joy, and longing. These psalms, filled with raw emotion and deep faith, became the foundation of Israel's worship. David's relationship with God was the anchor that kept him grounded through the many storms of his life. He knew that his strength came from God alone, and he constantly sought to remain in God's presence, trusting that the Lord would bring him through each trial. David's time in hiding may have seemed like a period of waiting, but in reality, it was a time of preparation. He was being shaped into the man who would one day lead Israel to greatness. Through every trial, every betrayal, and every close call with death, David's faith grew stronger. His heart, after all, was set on God's will, and he trusted that, in the end, God's plan would prevail. Though his path to the throne was long and fraught with danger, David knew that one day he would wear the crown that God had destined for him. David's path to kingship was far from simple, and the years that followed were filled with twists of fate, personal loss, and further tests of his character. After fleeing from Saul's relentless pursuit, David spent more time in hiding, surrounded by his loyal followers, who had now grown into a formidable group of warriors. Despite the bond they shared, David's heart remained heavy with the weight of what was happening in Israel. His home was no longer a place of peace, and he had lost the security that once came from his service in Saul's court. However, even in the midst of danger, David's faith remained unshaken, and he trusted that God's will would be accomplished in his perfect timing. David had learned many lessons during his time in the wilderness, the most significant of which was that God's protection and guidance were not just for the battlefield. They were meant for every aspect of his life. David's leadership qualities began to shine more clearly as he continued to care for his followers. He shared their hardships and offered counsel in their times of doubt. In turn, they looked up to him not only as a warrior, but as a leader who had a heart that sought after God. This period of hardship was essential to the forming of the kingdom David would one day rule. He was being molded into the man who would govern Israel, not with force, but with wisdom and compassion. One of the defining moments in David's time as a fugitive came when he encountered a man named Nabal, whose actions nearly led David down a path of sin. Nabal, a wealthy but arrogant man, refused to provide David and his men with food when they were in need, despite the fact that they had previously protected his shepherds. David, angry at the insult, ordered his men to prepare for battle, but Nabal's wife, Abigail, intervened. With wisdom and grace, Abigail met David with a gift of provisions and a humble apology on behalf of her husband. She reminded David that taking vengeance into his own hands would only tarnish his future reign. David, moved by her words and her faith, relented and spared Nabal's life. This moment marked a turning point in David's life, as it showed him that trusting God's justice was far more important than acting on personal anger. It also reaffirmed the importance of humility and listening to wise counsel. David's ability to make such a decision in the heat of the moment demonstrated the growth of his character. He had learned that true leadership was not about seeking personal glory, but about acting in accordance with God's will. Even when tempted by the opportunity to avenge an insult, David chose the path of mercy, recognizing that vengeance was not his to take. This experience with Abigail taught him to rely on God for justice and to trust that God's plans for his life would come to fruition, regardless of how the people around him acted. Meanwhile, Saul's pursuit of David continued. Saul's jealousy, which had taken root in his heart, had festered into a dangerous obsession. Despite the numerous opportunities David had to end Saul's life, David consistently chose to show mercy. Saul, on the other hand, could not control his hatred for David, and his envy blinded him to the truth. In the depths of his jealousy, Saul made irrational decisions, placing his own kingdom at risk and driving his people into fear. His obsession with killing David became a consuming force, and the people of Israel began to feel the weight of Saul's irrational decisions. One of the most significant events during this period occurred when David had another chance to kill Saul. Saul, unaware of David's presence, camped in a vulnerable spot with his army. David and his men, once again, found themselves in close proximity to Saul. David's men urged him to kill Saul, offering this as a chance to end their troubles once and for all. But David, with his heart set on God's will, refused to take matters into his own hands. Instead, he took Saul's spear and water jug as evidence that he could have easily taken Saul's life, but chose not to. This act of mercy once again demonstrated David's deep reliance on God's timing. Even though David could have seized the throne by force, he knew that only God could give him the throne in his own perfect timing. After David showed Saul the evidence of his restraint, Saul, moved by David's mercy, briefly repented and acknowledged David's future as king. But this moment of reconciliation did not last long. Saul once again allowed his jealousy to cloud his judgment, and he continued to pursue David. This cycle of mercy, followed by Saul's relapse into hatred, continued throughout David's fugitive years. It became clear that David's patience and trust in God were being tested to their limits. During this time, David composed many of the psalms that would later become central to Israel's worship. These psalms, written in the wilderness, reflect the depth of David's emotions, his struggles, and his unwavering trust in God. They offer a window into David's heart during the darkest times of his life as he wrestled with fear, anger, and doubt. Yet, despite the turbulence of his circumstances, David consistently found refuge in the presence of God. The Psalms became David's prayers, cries for deliverance, and songs of praise. Through his music and his words, David found peace in the midst of the storm. David's years of hiding were also a time of learning and growing as a leader. He became a king in the making, not by wearing a crown or sitting on a throne, but through the way he led his men trusted God in every situation. His leadership was not marked by arrogance or the desire for power, but by his humility and obedience to God. He was not a king in the eyes of the people, but in the eyes of God, he was already the anointed leader. And as David trusted in God, his men began to trust him as well. They saw in him a leader who was willing to sacrifice his own safety for the good of the people, a leader who would not take the throne by force, but wait for God's appointed time. Despite the difficulties of being a fugitive, David's character continued to shine through. His integrity, humility, and deep faith in God set him apart from Saul. While Saul, consumed by jealousy, destroyed his own kingdom, David was slowly, patiently, and quietly being prepared for the throne that would one day be his. Through each test and trial, David's heart was refined, and his faith in God's promises grew stronger. He learned that God's timing was always perfect, and that the throne would not be taken by force, but by God's grace. David's time as a fugitive was filled with lessons that would shape him into the king that Israel needed. Though he faced constant danger, his faith in God was unwavering, and he chose the path of mercy and justice over personal ambition. Through it all, he learned that true leadership comes not from seizing power, but from trusting in God's plan and waiting for his perfect timing. David's time as a fugitive did not simply pass in isolation and hiding. It was a period of forging alliances, learning hard lessons, and preparing for the role that God had called him to fulfill. It was a time that would eventually shape him into a ruler whose legacy would be remembered for generations. His journey continued with both triumphs and trials that revealed his true character, and with each step, David became more prepared for the challenges that lay ahead. As David spent more time on the run, his fame grew among the people. Though he was pursued by Saul, David's reputation as a warrior and a leader was becoming well known. His band of followers, once a group of disheartened men, had grown into a formidable force. They were loyal to David, not just because he was a great military leader, but because he treated them with kindness and respect, showing them the kind of leadership that Saul had failed to provide. They admired David's integrity, his faith, and his ability to lead not through fear, but through trust and love. He had shown them that true leadership was not about power, but about being able to lead with a heart that cared for the well-being of others. One of the most significant turning points in David's fugitive years came when he was faced with another opportunity to kill Saul. Saul, who had been relentlessly pursuing David, found himself in a vulnerable position. He had camped with his soldiers, unaware that David was near. This time, David's companion, Abishai, urged David to strike Saul, seeing this as a sign that God had delivered Saul into their hands. Yet, despite the pressure from his men, David refused to take the life of Saul. Instead, he took Saul's spear and water jug, leaving a clear sign that he could have killed the king, but chose not to. This act once again showed David's unwavering commitment to God's will. He understood that it was not his place to end Saul's life, but that God would deal with Saul in his perfect timing. When Saul woke up and saw that his spear and jug were missing, David called out to him from a distance. He revealed the evidence that he had spared Saul's life yet again. Saul, moved by David's mercy and his refusal to take revenge, acknowledged that David was indeed the chosen one to take the throne. But, as always, Saul's repentance was short-lived. He fell back into his jealousy and paranoia, continuing to hunt David. Despite this, David's heart remained resolute. He trusted that God would eventually bring him to the throne, but that the path to kingship was not for him to control. During this time of hardship, David also faced betrayals and challenges from other unexpected places. One of these challenges came in the form of a wealthy man named Nabal. David and his men had been providing protection for Nabal's shepherds and flocks, ensuring that no harm came to them. When David sent messengers to ask for provisions in return for their services, Nabal insulted him, refusing to offer anything. David, angered by this ingratitude, set out to confront Nabal. But before David could act, Nabal's wife, Abigail, intervened. She brought provisions to David and his men, offering an apology for her husband's rude behavior. Abigail's wisdom and her plea for mercy softened David's heart. Instead of acting on his anger, David spared Nabal's life, recognizing that God would bring justice in his own time. This encounter reinforced the lesson David had learned time and again, that vengeance belongs to God, not to him. As the years passed, David's faith was tested over and over. He had learned to trust in God's provision, but the constant threats to his life weighed heavily on him. Yet, throughout all the trials, David never lost sight of his ultimate purpose: to honor God and fulfill the calling that had been placed upon his life. His faith remained unshaken even when it seemed that his enemies, including Saul, would overwhelm him. David's trust in God's timing and his refusal to take matters into his own hands set him apart as a leader who was truly after God's heart. David's experiences as a fugitive were filled with moments that revealed the depth of his relationship with God. In the wilderness, David had nothing but his faith to sustain him. He had no palace, no throne, and no army. But what he did have was the knowledge that God was with him, that God had chosen him for a purpose, and that God's plan would unfold in its perfect time. David's Psalms, written during these years, reflected the depths of his soul. They expressed his despair, his longing for deliverance, and his unwavering trust in God's faithfulness. In moments of fear, David turned to God in prayer, seeking comfort and strength. In moments of joy, he praised God for his goodness and mercy. David also knew that leadership required humility. As a young man, he had been anointed as king, but he had not yet ascended to the throne. In the wilderness, David learned the importance of patience and trust in God's timing. He could have taken matters into his own hands, but he chose to wait for God's direction. His humility was not only demonstrated in his restraint with Saul, but also in his interactions with his followers. He treated them with kindness, shared in their hardships, and led them with integrity. David's leadership was rooted in his deep relationship with God, and his ability to lead came from his faith, not from his own strength. David's time in hiding also allowed him to reflect on the nature of kingship. He had been chosen by God to rule Israel, but he understood that true kingship was about serving God and the people, not seeking personal glory. He saw firsthand the destructive nature of Saul's jealousy and ambition, and he knew that the key to being a good king was humility, wisdom, and a heart that sought after God. David's kingship would not be defined by the size of his army or the wealth of his kingdom, but by his devotion to God and his commitment to leading the people with justice and righteousness. Though David's path to the throne was filled with hardships, his time as a fugitive shaped him into the man who would one day lead Israel to greatness. Through his trials, he learned to rely on God, to trust in his timing, and to lead with humility. His experiences during these years not only prepared him for kingship, but also strengthened his faith in God's promises. In the wilderness, David learned that true leadership is not about seizing power, but about waiting for God's perfect timing and trusting that his plan will always prevail. David's exile continued as a constant reminder that God's ways were not always immediately clear, but always perfect in their timing. During these years, while he was living in the wilderness and constantly on the run from Saul, David experienced a wide range of emotional and spiritual tests. He was not only physically challenged by the constant danger to his life, but was also spiritually tested as he waited on God's promises. Yet, through each trial, David grew stronger in his faith, and his understanding of what it truly meant to be a leader became deeper. David's growing band of followers was proof of the leadership he had developed. They were loyal to him, not because of his royal lineage or the promise of material rewards, but because they had seen in him a man who trusted in God. These men, many of whom had been outcasts in society, found hope in David, and together they became a tight-knit community. They shared in his struggles, fought alongside him, and came to see him not just as a military leader, but as a man of integrity and faith. Despite this loyalty, David's life remained filled with constant challenges. Saul, who was consumed by jealousy, continued to pursue him with relentless fury. David, however, remained committed to his path, choosing to trust in God's timing rather than trying to forcibly take the throne that had been promised to him. There were many moments when David had the opportunity to end Saul's life and claim the throne for himself, but David's restraint in these situations revealed a heart that was aligned with God's will, not his own ambition. One of the pivotal moments in this journey came when David was once again in the wilderness, and Saul's men, who were hunting him down, entered a cave where David and his men were hiding. Saul, unaware of David's presence, fell into a deep sleep. David's men, recognizing the opportunity, urged him to take advantage of this moment and kill Saul. But David, ever the man after God's heart, refused. He saw Saul's life as being in God's hands and believed that it was not for him to decide when Saul's reign would end. Instead of killing Saul, David secretly cut a piece of Saul's robe and later used it as proof that he had spared Saul's life when he confronted him. David's refusal to kill Saul, despite the pressure from his men, revealed his deep commitment to God's plan. He believed that the throne was not something he could take by force, but something that God would give him in his perfect time. This act of mercy, one of many during David's fugitive years, demonstrated a key aspect of his character: his trust in God's sovereignty. David understood that he could not control the timing of God's plan, but he could control how he responded to life's challenges. Despite Saul's apparent remorse at the moment, it was only temporary. His jealousy would always resurface, and he continued to pursue David with murderous intent. Saul's behavior grew more erratic as his fear and jealousy consumed him. David, however, remained patient. He knew that God's promises would not be thwarted by Saul's jealousy or actions. David's time in the wilderness was more than just a period of hiding. It was a time of preparation for the king that God had called him to be. The lessons David learned in the wilderness would be crucial in the years to come when he would eventually rise to the throne. David's relationship with God was deepened through his time in the wilderness. He composed many of the Psalms that would become a key part of Israel's worship, expressing his faith, fear, and longing for deliverance. The Psalms David wrote during these years reflect a heart that sought after God, even in the most difficult circumstances. He poured out his heart in prayer, seeking guidance and deliverance, but always acknowledging that God's will was perfect, even when it didn't align with his own desires. David's leadership was defined not by his military successes, but by his trust in God. He did not lead through force, but through faith. This faith was evident not only in his personal relationship with God, but also in how he treated those around him. As a leader, he cared deeply for his men, never asking them to face dangers that he himself was unwilling to face. He shared in their hardships and celebrated their victories. His ability to empathize with others and his humble heart were central to the way he led his followers. Despite the intense pressure and danger that came with being a fugitive, David continued to lead with integrity. He did not seek revenge, he did not allow the bitterness of being hunted to consume him, and he did not let the allure of power cloud his judgment. He knew that the throne would one day be his, but that it was not for him to claim in his own strength. The path to kingship was a journey of trusting God, of learning to lead with humility, and of understanding that true authority comes from God alone. One of the most significant tests of David's character during this time came when he encountered Nabal, a wealthy but foolish man who insulted David and his men despite the protection they had provided. David, angered by the insult, set out to confront Nabal, but Abigail, Nabal's wise wife, intervened. She offered provisions and a humble apology on behalf of her husband, reminding David that vengeance belonged to God. David, humbled by her wisdom, spared Nabal's life and praised God for sending Abigail to stop him from making a costly mistake. This encounter further shaped David's understanding of leadership, showing him that true leadership is not about force or revenge, but about following God's will and trusting that he would bring justice in his perfect time. Through these experiences, David learned that leadership was not about personal ambition or power, but about serving others, protecting them, and leading them with wisdom and faith. His heart was after God's own heart, and it was this deep devotion that set him apart. His time in hiding, far from being a time of waiting without purpose, was in fact a time of preparation, a time in which David's character was refined, his trust in God deepened, and his leadership qualities were honed. As David trusted God's timing, his faith grew, and the day would come when the throne of Israel would be his, not by force, but by God's divine will. David's life continued to unfold in ways that further tested his faith and his commitment to God's will. Despite the difficulties, challenges, and personal losses that he experienced, he remained faithful to the path that God had set before him. As he continued to evade Saul's relentless pursuit, David found himself not only facing physical threats, but also wrestling with the emotional and spiritual weight of his circumstances. The wilderness became not just a place of hiding, but a place of deep reflection and growth. It was in these lonely, barren places that David's character was further shaped as he learned to rely on God more completely. Through the years, David had to continually face Saul's hostility and fear. Saul's jealousy of David, which had first emerged when the people began to sing songs of David's military victories, had transformed into a deeply rooted animosity. As David's popularity grew, Saul's grip on the throne weakened, and the once noble king's decisions became increasingly erratic and dangerous. Saul's jealousy and paranoia led him to seek David's life time and time again, convinced that David was a threat to his reign. Yet David, despite the constant pressure, refused to take matters into his own hands. He understood that the throne was God's to give, not something to be seized by human force. One of the most defining moments of David's time as a fugitive came when Saul once again was in pursuit of him. This time, Saul unknowingly entered the very cave where David and his men were hiding. When Saul came inside, David's men saw an opportunity to end their suffering and urged David to kill Saul, saying that this was the moment God had delivered Saul into their hands. But David, ever the man of God, refused. He believed that God's timing would dictate when Saul's reign would end, and it was not for him to bring it to an end prematurely. Instead, David secretly cut a piece of Saul's robe to prove that he had spared Saul's life. When Saul left the cave, David called after him, revealing the piece of his robe and showing him that he had chosen mercy over vengeance. Saul, moved by David's restraint and his willingness to forgive, acknowledged that David was the rightful heir to the throne. However, Saul's repentance was short-lived and his jealousy quickly resurfaced. Despite David's act of mercy, Saul continued to pursue him, determined to destroy him. This cycle of mercy, followed by Saul's renewed aggression, continued throughout David's fugitive years. However, David never allowed the bitterness or fear of being pursued to control him. He continued to trust in God's plan, knowing that one day the throne would be his, but only in God's timing. While on the run, David's leadership continued to grow, as did his influence over those who followed him. His band of followers, once a small group of outcasts and desperate men, had grown into a formidable army. These men followed David not because of the promises of power or riches, but because of his character and leadership. They saw in David a man of integrity, a man who trusted in God, and a man who was willing to sacrifice his own comfort for the sake of others. These men became David's mighty warriors, and together they fought battles, protected one another, and lived through the hardships of exile. David's ability to lead in the wilderness was a testament to the kind of king he would one day be. He had learned to lead not through fear or manipulation, but through trust in God and the compassion he showed to others. One significant episode during this time was David's encounter with a wealthy man named Nabal. David and his men had been providing protection for Nabal's sheep and shepherds, yet when David sent a request for provisions, Nabal insulted him, refusing to offer anything. David, angered by the insult, set out to confront Nabal and punish him for his disrespect. But Nabal's wife, Abigail, intervened. She brought provisions to David, humbly apologized on behalf of her husband, and urged David to reconsider his actions. Abigail's wisdom and faith in God's justice moved David to spare Nabal's life. He recognized that vengeance was not his to take, and this encounter reinforced the lesson that David had learned many times, that God's justice would prevail in his perfect timing. David's decision to spare Nabal's life was not just a reflection of his mercy, but also of his trust in God's plan. David understood that true leadership was not about seeking revenge or taking matters into his own hands. It was about waiting for God's guidance and trusting that he would bring about justice. Through Abigail's intervention, David learned that his role as a leader was to act in accordance with God's will, even when his emotions or circumstances urged him to take the easier path of vengeance. This lesson became a cornerstone of David's leadership, one that would be crucial as he continued to face both internal and external challenges. During these years of hiding, David's Psalms continued to reflect his heart's deepest emotions. When he felt abandoned, he cried out to God in his prayers, and when he felt God's presence, he wrote songs of praise. The Psalms David composed in the wilderness are some of the most heartfelt and profound expressions of faith in the Bible. They reflect David's struggles with fear, his trust in God's faithfulness, and his longing for deliverance. They also reveal the depth of David's relationship with God, one that was built on trust, honesty, and a deep reliance on God's provision and protection. These Psalms, written during the most difficult and uncertain times of David's life, would later become an essential part of Israel's worship and a testament to David's heart for God. As David's time in hiding continued, the conflict with Saul escalated. Saul, in his madness, grew increasingly paranoid and obsessed with destroying David. Yet David continued to show mercy even when he had the opportunity to kill Saul. Each time, David chose the path of patience, trusting that God's timing would bring about the end of Saul's reign. Through these tests, David's character was refined. He learned that leadership was not about power, but about following God's lead and trusting that in his time, the crown would be his. David's years as a fugitive were not wasted. They were a time of growth, learning, and preparation. He learned to rely on God's strength and not his own. He learned to lead with compassion, to forgive when wronged, and to trust in God's timing, even when it seemed like the path to kingship was long and uncertain. And through it all, David remained faithful to God, knowing that he would bring him to the throne when the time was right. As the years of exile stretched on, David's life became more complex, filled with victories, deepening friendships, and further tests of his character. The wilderness, which had once felt like a place of solitude and fear, became a place where David learned to trust God more fully, relying on him for guidance and strength in every moment. Even as he faced constant threats from Saul, his faith grew stronger. David began to realize that his time in hiding was not merely a season of waiting. It was a necessary period of preparation that God had destined for him. David's character continued to be shaped during these trials, and his leadership evolved in profound ways. One of the most striking aspects of David's leadership was his ability to remain humble despite his growing fame. Throughout his time as a fugitive, he could have easily taken the throne through force or manipulation, but he chose not to. Instead, he waited for God's timing, understanding that God was refining him for something far greater than he could have imagined. His patience and unwavering faith were key to his ultimate success as Israel's king. During this period, David's band of followers grew into an army that was both loyal and fiercely devoted to him. They were men who had nothing left to lose, but found hope and purpose in David's leadership. He was not just their leader, but a symbol of justice, mercy, and God's provision. The wilderness became a place of camaraderie and mutual support as David and his followers fought side by side against Israel's enemies, always trusting that God was with them. Through it all, David's character as a leader was becoming clearer to all who followed him. They saw in him not only strength but compassion, not just military prowess, but a heart that sought after God. Yet, the threat from Saul remained constant. Saul, consumed by jealousy and fear, continued to pursue David with unrelenting rage. Despite being anointed as the future king, David remained patient, refusing to raise his hand against Saul, the man who had once been his mentor and protector. There were several instances where David had the opportunity to kill Saul, but each time he chose mercy. He recognized that Saul's time as king would come to an end, but it was not for David to decide when. This restraint, which was at times difficult to bear, demonstrated the depth of David's trust in God's sovereignty. He knew that God's timing would bring him to the throne, but he also knew that he had to remain faithful to the path God had laid before him. David's time in hiding also brought him into contact with people who would play crucial roles in his life. One such person was Abigail, the wife of Nabal. Nabal had insulted David and refused to offer provisions to him and his men, even though they had protected his shepherds. Enraged by the insult, David set out to punish Nabal, but Abigail, Nabal's wise and discerning wife, intervened. She brought provisions to David, apologized on behalf of her husband, and reminded him that vengeance belonged to God, not to David. David, humbled by her wisdom and faith, chose to spare Nabal's life. This encounter was another pivotal moment in David's life, teaching him that true leadership was about trusting in God's justice, not seeking revenge. Abigail's intervention reminded David that he was not to act impulsively, but to wait for God's judgment. David's relationship with Abigail also highlighted another important aspect of leadership: humility. Despite the immense challenges David faced, he remained humble in his role as a leader. He did not seek to elevate himself, even when he could have easily done so. He relied on God for guidance, understanding that true leadership was not about power or status, but about serving others. Through his actions, David demonstrated what it meant to lead with integrity and honor. His ability to show mercy, even to those who had wronged him, set him apart as a leader who truly sought after God's will. Another defining moment during David's time in the wilderness came when he faced an opportunity to confront Saul again. Once again, Saul had encamped with his army, unaware that David and his men were nearby. This time, David and his companion Abishai crept into Saul's camp while Saul and his soldiers slept. Abishai, seeing the opportunity, urged David to kill Saul, but David, with his heart firmly set on God's will, refused. Instead, he took Saul's spear and water jug as evidence that he could have killed him, but chose not to. This act of mercy was yet another testament to David's deep reliance on God's plan for his life. He trusted that God would bring about Saul's downfall in his own perfect time, and that David's role was not to take matters into his own hands. When David confronted Saul once again, revealing the evidence of his mercy, Saul was moved to tears. He acknowledged that David was the rightful king and that he had been wrong to pursue him. However, Saul's repentance was short-lived, and his jealousy once again took hold of him. He returned to his obsessive pursuit of David, but David, ever faithful, continued to trust in God's plan. David's restraint in this moment once again demonstrated his trust in God's timing, as he waited patiently for the throne that had been promised to him. In addition to his internal battles, David also faced external challenges from the enemies of Israel. Throughout his time as a fugitive, he fought battles against various nations, including the Philistines, the Amalekites, and the Geshurites. Despite being outnumbered and outgunned, David's military prowess was undeniable. He led his men with skill and strategy, and God's favor was evident in every victory. But even in the midst of his military successes, David never lost sight of the fact that it was God who had given him these victories. He did not boast in his own strength, but gave glory to God for each triumph. David's time in exile was also marked by personal loss. The death of his firstborn son, born to Bathsheba, was a heart-wrenching moment in David's life. The baby fell ill, and David fasted and prayed, hoping that God would spare the child. But despite his desperate pleas, the child died. David's response to this loss was profound. Instead of continuing to mourn, he washed himself, worshiped God, and moved forward with his life. His acceptance of God's will, even in the face of personal pain, was a powerful testament to his faith. David understood that God's ways were often beyond human understanding, but he chose to trust that God's plan was always for his good. Through all the trials, betrayals, and personal losses, David's character was refined. His patience, humility, and trust in God became the foundation of his leadership. When the time finally came for David to ascend to the throne, he was not a king who sought power for his own gain, but a king who had learned to lead with a heart after God's own heart. His time in the wilderness had prepared him for the challenges of kingship, and he was ready to lead Israel not by his own strength, but by the wisdom and guidance that came from his deep relationship with God. David's journey from fugitive to king was a long and difficult one, but through it all, his faith never wavered. He trusted that God had a plan for his life, and that in God's perfect timing, he would take his place on the throne. Through every trial, David grew stronger in his faith and more certain of his calling. And when the time came, he did not seize the throne by force, but accepted it as God's gift, trusting that his kingship would be for the glory of God and the good of his people. David's life as a fugitive was not merely a time of avoiding Saul's constant pursuit, but a period of intense spiritual growth and reflection. As he spent years on the run, David faced challenges that would refine him into the king God intended him to be. He found himself constantly seeking God's guidance, praying for deliverance and wisdom, and reflecting on the lessons God wanted him to learn. Through his struggles, he deepened his trust in God, which would prove invaluable as he prepared for the moment when he would finally take the throne. One of the key lessons David learned during his time in exile was the importance of patience. David knew that he had been anointed as king, yet he had to wait for God's perfect timing. Throughout his fugitive years, David encountered numerous opportunities to take matters into his own hands, but he always chose the path of restraint. Whether it was sparing Saul's life or not seizing power through force, David demonstrated a deep understanding that God's plan for him would unfold in its own time. His faithfulness during this period of waiting showed his unwavering belief that the throne would come, but only when God decided it was the right time. David's patience was tested again when he encountered Saul on two separate occasions in the wilderness. On both occasions, David had the opportunity to kill Saul, who was sleeping in a vulnerable position. But David resisted the temptation to take vengeance. Instead, he took Saul's spear and water jug, leaving clear evidence that he could have killed him, but chose not to. When David confronted Saul, Saul was moved by David's mercy and acknowledged that David was the rightful king. However, Saul's repentance was fleeting, and he continued to pursue David with the intent to kill him. Despite the repeated attempts on his life, David never lost his faith or his sense of calling. He continued to trust that God would bring him to the throne in his time, and that God would protect him from his enemies. David's restraint in the face of Saul's pursuit showed his understanding that true kingship was not about taking power by force, but about being called and appointed by God. David's character continued to evolve as he navigated his role as a leader of a growing group of men who followed him in the wilderness. Many of these men were outcasts, desperate for a cause to fight for, but David treated them with kindness, dignity, and respect, showing that true leadership comes from a heart that cares for others. His followers became fiercely loyal to him, not because of the promise of material rewards, but because they saw in David a leader who truly understood their struggles and cared for their well-being. David's relationship with his followers was built on trust and mutual respect, and in turn, these men supported him with unwavering loyalty. One of the more defining moments of David's time in the wilderness came when he encountered Nabal, a wealthy man who insulted David after David had protected his shepherds. David, angered by the insult, set out to confront Nabal, but before David could act, Abigail, Nabal's wife, intervened. Abigail's wisdom, humility, and quick thinking saved her husband's life. She brought provisions to David, apologized on behalf of her husband, and urged him not to take vengeance into his own hands. David, impressed by Abigail's wisdom and faith, chose to spare Nabal's life, showing once again that he trusted in God's judgment rather than acting out of anger. This moment reinforced David's understanding that leadership was not about taking revenge, but about waiting for God to act in his own perfect time. Abigail's intervention also demonstrated the kind of humility David needed to lead effectively. He learned that sometimes God uses others to correct and guide us, and that it takes humility to accept advice and wisdom from unexpected sources. David's willingness to listen to Abigail showed his growth as a leader and his commitment to doing things God's way. His restraint, mercy, and faith in God's timing in this situation served as a powerful reminder that leadership is not about exerting control, but about trusting God to work through all situations. David's growing faith was also evident in the Psalms he wrote during these years in the wilderness. His Psalms expressed his deep feelings of fear, sorrow, gratitude, and praise. He wrote songs of worship that reflected his trust in God, his longing for deliverance, and his confidence that God would ultimately bring him through his trials. These psalms became an essential part of Israel's worship, and they provide a glimpse into David's heart and his relationship with God. They reveal a man who, despite his hardships, continually sought God's presence and guidance. Even as David experienced personal triumphs, his life as a fugitive was marked by loss and hardship. He had lost his position in the palace, his family, and his status as a respected leader in Israel. But he never lost his relationship with God. It was during this time of personal loss and uncertainty that David learned to fully rely on God for his strength, his provision, and his future. The wilderness became a place where David learned to trust God completely, not just in moments of joy, but in moments of sorrow and fear as well. As David waited for God's timing, he learned that true kingship was not about political maneuvering or military might. It was about serving God and his people with a humble heart and a willingness to obey God's will. David's time in the wilderness, though difficult and filled with trials, shaped him into the kind of leader who would be remembered not for his power or achievements, but for his heart after God. He became a king who led with wisdom, compassion, and faith, traits that were forged in the fire of exile. David's ability to lead in the wilderness, his trust in God's timing, and his refusal to take matters into his own hands set him apart from the other leaders of his time. His time as a fugitive was not wasted. It was a season of preparation, a season that refined him and deepened his relationship with God. And when the time came for David to take the throne, he was ready, not because of his military victories or his personal ambition, but because he had learned to trust in God's plan for his life. In the years to come, as David would finally ascend to the throne of Israel, he would continue to demonstrate the qualities that had made him a man after God's own heart: humility, patience, mercy, and an unwavering trust in God's sovereignty. His time in the wilderness had prepared him to be the kind of king God wanted him to be, one who would lead Israel with wisdom, justice, and faithfulness. David's life was about to take a dramatic turn as the long-awaited day of his ascension to the throne drew near. After years of wandering and hiding, he had faced countless trials, betrayals, and moments of deep personal reflection. The wilderness had become the crucible in which his character was refined, and now the time had come for him to step into the role that God had promised him all those years ago. Yet, even with this promise fulfilled, David knew that the journey ahead would not be without its challenges. The final days of Saul's reign were marked by tragedy and despair. Saul, the king who had once been chosen by God, had fallen so far from grace that he could no longer hear God's voice. His jealousy and paranoia consumed him, and he became a shadow of the king he once was. Desperate, Saul sought to consult the spirits of the dead, even defying his own previous commands to rid Israel of sorcery and witchcraft. This act of rebellion marked the end of Saul's reign. God had rejected Saul as king, and the people of Israel were waiting for the promised change. It was a time of unrest as the kingdom was divided and the threat of the Philistines loomed larger than ever. Saul's army, once a formidable force, was now crumbling, its king caught in a spiral of fear and defeat. In the midst of this chaos, David, though still living in exile, saw an opportunity for the nation to heal. But before he could claim the throne, Saul's life was tragically cut short on the battlefield. The death of Saul and his sons marked a turning point in Israel's history. As the news of the king's death spread, David mourned, but he did not immediately seek the throne. He knew that God's plan would unfold in his time. When Saul died on the battlefield, David's first instinct was not to claim victory, but to mourn for the fallen king and for his dear friend Jonathan, Saul's son, who had been David's closest companion. The depth of David's grief for Jonathan was profound. His love for his friend had been stronger than the bond of brothers, and the loss of Jonathan hit David harder than anything else. David's response to Saul's death was a testament to his heart for God. He did not gloat over Saul's downfall or take the throne by force. Instead, he mourned deeply, composing a song of lament that would be sung throughout Israel to honor the king and his sons. David's grief was sincere, and his mourning for Saul was a demonstration of his respect for the man who had once been his mentor. David's mourning for Saul and Jonathan was not just a personal loss, it was the loss of an entire era in Israel's history. After Saul's death, the kingdom was divided. Saul's son, Ishbosheth, was installed as king by Abner, the army commander, but David was anointed king of Judah in the city of Hebron. This division in the kingdom led to years of civil war, as David's supporters clashed with those who remained loyal to Saul's family. Despite the challenges, David continued to seek God's guidance. He knew that his reign would not be a simple transition from fugitive to king, and that the path to unity would require patience, wisdom, and grace. David's military success was one of the key factors in his eventual rise to power. His loyal followers, many of whom had fought alongside him in the wilderness, were now his army. David's leadership continued to grow as he led his forces to victory in battle after battle. Yet, David never forgot that his strength came from God. He acknowledged God's sovereignty in every victory and always gave glory to him for the successes of his army. David's patience was again tested when Abner, the leader of Saul's army, had a falling out with Ishbosheth, Saul's son. Abner had been the real power behind Ishbosheth's reign, but after a dispute, he defected to David's side. Abner's defection marked a pivotal moment as David's power base grew stronger. However, this shift in alliances came with its own set of challenges. Abner's change of allegiance did not go unnoticed, and Joab, David's military commander, was furious that Abner had killed his brother in battle. In his rage, Joab took matters into his own hands and killed Abner, despite David's efforts to maintain peace. David once again demonstrated his commitment to justice and peace by mourning Abner's death publicly. He made it clear that Joab's actions were not condoned, and that David's reign would not be marked by personal vendettas or acts of revenge. David's integrity in the face of such betrayal was a testament to his heart as a leader. He was determined that his kingdom would be founded on principles of righteousness and justice, even if it meant facing internal conflict. As David's power grew, so did the challenges that came with it. His rise to the throne was not without obstacles, and the struggle to unite Israel under his rule was ongoing. Yet, David continued to seek God's guidance in every decision. His humility, patience, and unwavering trust in God allowed him to lead Israel with wisdom, even in the midst of political turmoil and warfare. During these tumultuous years, David also took steps to secure the kingdom's future. His first major act as king of all Israel was to capture Jerusalem, a city that had long been held by the Jebusites. Jerusalem's strategic location made it an ideal capital, and David knew that this city would become the center of Israel's political and spiritual life. The conquest of Jerusalem was a significant military achievement, and it symbolized the unification of the kingdom under David's leadership. The city became the heart of Israel, and David made it his capital, further consolidating his rule over the entire nation. As David's reign continued, he also focused on uniting the people of Israel in worship. One of his greatest achievements was bringing the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. The Ark, which symbolized God's presence among his people, had been kept in various places during Saul's reign. But David understood that the Ark needed to be central to Israel's worship and national identity. In an elaborate procession, David brought the Ark to Jerusalem with great celebration, dancing before the Lord in a display of joy and reverence. However, this event was not without controversy, as David's wife, Michal, Saul's daughter, criticized him for dancing so freely before the people. David's response was firm, stating that he was dancing before God, and he would not be ashamed of worshiping God in such a manner. This moment reinforced David's commitment to honoring God above all else, regardless of the opinions of others. Despite the success of his reign, David's life was not without its difficulties. His sin with Bathsheba, one of the darkest chapters of his life, would bring consequences that affected his family and his kingdom. David's affair with Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah, resulted in the murder of Uriah and the birth of a child. Though David repented for his sin, the consequences were severe. His child with Bathsheba died, and his family was torn apart by internal strife. Yet through it all, David's heart remained humble before God. He repented, sought forgiveness, and accepted the consequences of his actions. David's reign, though marred by personal sin, was marked by his unwavering commitment to God's will. His heart after God's own heart led him to seek justice, to defend the oppressed, and to lead the people of Israel in worship. Despite the failures, the challenges, and the trials he faced, David's life remained a testament to the power of repentance, grace, and God's faithfulness. As David grew older, his kingdom flourished, and his legacy was solidified as one of the greatest leaders in Israel's history. Yet he never forgot that it was God who had called him and God who had made him king. David's reign would set the stage for the future of Israel, and his lineage would continue to shape the destiny of God's people.